The guards didn't understand what they were confiscating. As they smashed my computers and confiscated my teaching materials, they laughed about women playing with machines. The judge who sentenced me to 3 years in prison for corrupting female minds with Western technological propaganda believed he was protecting society. They stripped everything from me, my equipment, my freedom, my dignity. But they couldn't take the code from my mind. And in the silence of that cell, I began to design their undoing. They thought they were deleting my work. Instead, they were compiling something far more powerful. This is how imprisonment became the foundation for a digital revolution that's freeing women in restrictive regimes worldwide. My name is Nadia Khoury. I grew up in a society where women's futures were predetermined. Marriage by 20, motherhood by 22, modesty always. In our coastal city, ancient traditions blended uncomfortably with modern surveillance. Men controlled the digital realm as they controlled everything else. Technology was not just a male domain but a tool of social control, computers a privilege of the elite and the security apparatus. Our neighborhood in the old district was a maze of narrow streets where whispers traveled faster than the intermittent internet. My father, Ibrahim, was different. An electrical engineer educated abroad in the 1990s before returning home to family obligations, he carried with him memories of a world where ideas flowed freely. He worked at the State Telecommunications Company, a position that afforded him both privilege and suspicion. At home, behind closed shutters and signal-blocking curtains he had designed himself, he created a different world for his family. The mind should never be imprisoned, he told me once, his voice barely audible over the evening call to prayer. Not by walls, not by fear, and certainly not by what others decide you should know. When I was 11, he brought home a refurbished ThinkPad laptop wrapped in layers of protective cloth. The plastic casing was cracked at one corner, the charging cable spliced and repaired multiple times. He placed it in my hands with the reverence of passing down an ancestral treasure. "The world is changing," he whispered, glancing at the door though my mother supported his quiet rebellion. "You must change with it, Nadia. Learn its language." That laptop became my gateway to another existence. At first, I learned basic programs, spreadsheets, word processing, tools that might be explained away as helping with my father's work if discovered. But at night, using offline programming tutorials my father smuggled home on flash drives, I ventured deeper. The logic of code spoke to me with a clarity that transcended our restrictive world. In programming, there were problems and solutions, not permissions and prohibitions. By 14, I was reverse engineering simple games to understand their mechanics. By 16, I had mastered several programming languages, staying up after midnight when the household slept, the computer screen carefully angled away from windows, a heavy blanket draped over me to hide the glow. I kept meticulous handwritten journals of my progress using a notation system I developed, part code, part private language that would appear as schoolgirl doodles to anyone who searched my room. My mother, Samira, though formerly uneducated, protected these midnight sessions with the vigilance of a sentinel, developing elaborate signals to warn me of unexpected visitors or neighborhood patrols. "They can control what we say in public," she told me once, braiding my hair with fingers calloused from decades of domestic work. "But they cannot control what we build in our minds." When I was 17, my coding skills advanced enough to create a simple encrypted messaging system. I experienced a revelation. Walking past the Women's Vocational Center where girls my age were being trained for appropriate careers, sewing, cooking, basic administrative work, I saw their faces through the windows. Some resigned, some rebellious, all limited by the narrowness of their options. I recognized something in their expressions that mirrored my own public face, the careful mask that concealed inner thoughts. That evening, I approached my cousin Layla after family dinner. She had always shown curiosity about my schoolbooks, asking questions that probed beyond the sanitized curriculum we were fed. With my father's cautious blessing, I showed her basic HTML on my laptop. The wonder in her eyes as she changed the color of text with a simple tag ignited something in me, a purpose. By 18, I was helping a small circle of trusted friends decode HTML, build basic websites, and understand the fundamentals of programming logic. We created simple games that incorporated our cultural stories but gave the female characters agency and power. We built mock social networks where we could express uncensored thoughts. We dreamed in code because it was the only language that gave us the freedom to dream at all. Finding a secure meeting place became our first challenge. My bedroom was too risky. Groups of young women visiting regularly would draw attention. Public spaces were under constant surveillance. The solution came from my mother's sister, Fatima. Aunt Fatima ran a small tailoring shop in the commercial district, specializing in wedding linens and traditional garments. The perfect cover, as women's textiles were considered appropriate feminine work. The shop had a back room used for private fittings and inventory that could be secured from casual observation. My aunt, though initially nervous, became our fiercest protector. Women have always passed secrets through their needlework, she said, showing me centuries-old embroidery patterns that contained hidden messages. Your code is just the newest thread in a very old tapestry. We disguised our gatherings as a modern sewing circle, a cultural crafting group where young women learned traditional skills. I painted our meetings as a return to cultural values in the community. Laptops were hidden inside sewing baskets, flash drives concealed in pincushions, printouts disguised as pattern templates. In reality, we were weaving something far more subversive, a network of technically skilled women who could see beyond our restricted horizons. Word spread carefully, girl to girl, sister to cousin, through whispers at family gatherings and coded messages in school notebooks. Each potential member was carefully vetted, observed for months before being approached. Trust was our most valuable currency in a society built on surveillance. Our selection criteria evolved beyond mere interest. We looked for young women who questioned subtly, who showed resilience, who demonstrated the ability to keep secrets. Dahlia came to us after seeing her brother's programming textbooks and being told they weren't appropriate for her studies. Yasmin joined after being removed from her university physics class when the administration recategorized it as male-appropriate content. Zainab, at only 15, was already maintaining her father's business spreadsheets but told to pursue home economics instead of mathematics. Our group grew from 5 to 15, then 30 across different neighborhoods. We called ourselves the Invisible Threads, women learning to weave the digital fabric that men believed we couldn't understand. Many traveled hours to attend, navigating complex family excuses and public transportation systems where women were frequently harassed. They would arrive with official permission to learn embroidery or dressmaking, carrying fabric and thread alongside secretly embedded flash drives. For some, like Miriam, whose marriage had been arranged for her 19th birthday, our twice-weekly meetings were her only taste of independence, of creation outside prescribed boundaries. For 3 hours, she told me once, fingers flying across the keyboard as she debugged a program, I exist beyond my body, beyond the constraints they've placed on it. In code, I am free. We developed a curriculum that progressed from basic digital literacy to advanced programming concepts. We taught network security alongside web development, focusing intensely on privacy tools and encryption, skills that were not just educational but potentially life-saving in our context. Every lesson incorporated our cultural context, using familiar analogies to make abstract concepts concrete. Algorithmic thinking was explained through traditional cooking recipes. Database structures were compared to family genealogies. Object-oriented programming became a metaphor for our social structures, but with the ability to rewrite the rules of inheritance and access. As our collective skills advanced, so did the risks. Government monitoring of Internet activity increased following the social uprisings in neighboring countries. New regulations required identification for all SIM card purchases. Public Wi-Fi networks implemented deep packet inspection. Our technical response had to evolve alongside these challenges. I was 21 when I recognized that our in-person model couldn't scale to meet the growing demand. Too many women couldn't reach our physical locations, and larger gatherings increased our exposure. Working through sleepless nights while maintaining my public persona as a dutiful daughter preparing for an appropriate marriage, I developed our first mobile curriculum. The innovation was both technical and cultural. Teaching materials disguised as a fashion catalog app that, when accessed with the right sequence of interactions, unlocked coding tutorials in our native language. The application displayed traditional clothing patterns and modest fashion when opened normally. Content that would raise no suspicion if a woman's phone was checked by male family members. But when a specific sequence of items was viewed in a particular order, a sequence based on a famous woman mathematician's birthdate, the app transformed. Behind this digital veil, we created comprehensive programming lessons, each disguised as a different category of women's clothing. Wedding attire contained HTML and CSS basics. Festival garments housed JavaScript tutorials. Professional wear covered database fundamentals. Each lesson included practical exercises that could be completed within the app's secure environment, with code that left no obvious traces in the device's standard storage. We distributed it carefully, a digital Sawmis dot, woman to woman. Each new user received personal instruction on security protocols, when to use it, how to quickly switch to its cover interface, how to delete all traces if needed. The app contained an emergency button that would instantly revert to its cover identity and wipe all user progress if pressed, a necessary precaution for women studying in households where phones might be inspected without warning. On an ordinary Tuesday in late spring, as jasmine bloomed outside the shop windows and 18 women worked on a database project inside, our world collapsed. The raid came without warning, the moment I had prepared for but hoped would never arrive. Someone had betrayed us. We later learned it was the brother of Samia, one of our newest members. He had found his sister's hidden notes and, alarmed by symbols he didn't understand, reported her to the Morality and Cybercrimes Unit. Through it all, the lead investigator, Colonel Burricate, focused on me. He moved with the confidence of someone who had studied his target extensively. He knew my name, my family, my educational history. He called me the corrupting influence, the Western agent, destroying traditional values. When he found my private notebooks with their coded annotations, he smiled with the satisfaction of a predator. Women's minds weren't designed for technology, he told me, flipping through my notes with gloved hands. When you force the female brain into these unnatural patterns, you create dysfunction in both the woman and the society that depends on her natural functioning. The 16 days between arrest and trial were a calculated exercise in psychological warfare. I was held in solitary confinement, interrupted only by interrogation sessions focused less on gathering information and more on breaking my resolve. They presented printouts of our educational materials, seized communications, and student lists. They knew most of what we had done but were obsessed with proving foreign backing, convinced that women couldn't have created such systems independently. My family was permitted one visit. My mother, visibly aged, whispered practical advice about prison survival. My father, his engineering dignity stripped away by fear for his daughter, could barely speak. When the guards weren't looking, he pressed something into my palm, a tiny scrap of paper with a mathematical equation that had been our private joke since childhood. A problem with multiple solutions, a reminder that no single path was the only way forward. The trial was swift, performative justice rather than actual jurisprudence. They displayed our equipment as though it was contraband, our teaching materials as evidence of moral corruption. The prosecution portrayed me as an agent of foreign cultural infiltration, using technology to lure women away from their natural roles. The state-appointed defense attorney spoke for less than 10 minutes, suggesting leniency based on my youth and the possibility of rehabilitation. 3 young women from our group were called as witnesses against me, their testimonies clearly coerced. I could see the apology in their eyes as they confirmed that I had led the group, that I had created the educational materials, that I had encouraged them to pursue unauthorized knowledge. I nodded slightly to each, absolving them of their forced betrayal. The verdict was announced after a mere 40 minutes of deliberation, guilty on all counts. 3 years imprisonment for propagating foreign ideologies, unauthorized technology dissemination, corrupting female youth, and organizing illegal gatherings. A lifetime ban from using or owning computing devices. A permanent record that would prevent any formal employment in my field. As they led me from the courtroom, I caught a final glimpse of my father. His face, once confident and forward-looking, now carried the weight of both grief and guilt, the father who had encouraged his daughter's mind now watching the consequences of that freedom. Tears streaming into his graying beard, he mouthed words I couldn't hear but understood clearly. I'm sorry. I wanted to tell him not to apologize for awakening my mind, for showing me possibilities beyond our society's barriers. But there was no time before the doors closed between us. Women's Correctional Facility No. 3 was architecture as psychology, designed not just to contain bodies but to break spirits. Located 2 hours from the capital in an industrial district, its concrete walls absorbed both sound and hope. The first month was isolation in a cell barely large enough for a narrow bed and toilet. No books, no paper, no contact except for guards who delivered meals and religious counselors who delivered lectures on feminine submission. The isolation was calculated, to disorient, to emphasize powerlessness, to provide ample time for regret and reconsidering one's choices. The guards addressed me only as inmate 22 to 47, never by name, a small erasure of identity repeated dozens of times daily. The physical discomforts were numerous but secondary to the psychological assault. Sleep deprivation from lights that never fully dimmed. Unpredictable schedule changes to prevent establishing routines. The constant background noise of propaganda broadcasts espousing women's proper roles. Weekly rehabilitation sessions, where male religious authorities describe the corruption of women's minds through Western technological influence. In the second month, I was moved to a shared cell and permitted limited communal activities, all designed around domestic skills training. Cooking, cleaning, childcare preparation, the approved curriculum for female rehabilitation. I participated mechanically, conserving my mental energy for the work happening inside my mind. Without access to computers or even paper and pencil most days, I developed new cognitive disciplines. Each morning, I would wake before dawn and use the brief privacy to scratch code into the condensation on my cell window, ephemeral practice sessions that disappeared as the sun rose, leaving no evidence. I would trace algorithms with my finger, debug imaginary systems, design interfaces that existed only in my visualization. The guard who discovered this ritual one morning was puzzled rather than punitive. "Writing messages to someone?" she asked, watching the strange symbols I traced in the moisture. "Just reminding myself who I am," I answered truthfully. She shook her head. "Better to forget who you were outside and accept who you must be now." But in that empty space, with only my mind as a resource, I began to map out something new. The enforced absence of technology created the perfect laboratory for pure conceptual design. Without the distractions of implementation details or existing frameworks, I mentally architected an entirely new platform, one built for security from its foundation, designed specifically for our context. Each afternoon, I would memorize a new pattern segment from the crafting room. At night, I would convert it into a computational structure, storing it in memory through repetition. The irony was profound. These patterns, approved by the same authorities who banned women from advanced computing, contained perfect structures for sophisticated cryptographic systems that could resist state surveillance. 4 months into my sentence, my solitary existence was interrupted by the arrival of a cellmate. Layla Hakim was 42, a former literature professor imprisoned for political poetry that encouraged female rebellion. Small in stature but enormous in intellectual presence, she brought with her a wealth of cultural knowledge. Initially suspicious of each other, prison breeds wariness, we slowly recognized kindred spirits. Our whispered conversations began with literature, then history, then politics, and finally technology. When I explained what I had been creating in my mind, she didn't dismiss it as prison fantasy but engaged with it as serious intellectual work. Layla's contribution was transformative. Trained in our region's oral tradition, she taught me ancient mnemonic techniques used by storytellers to memorize thousands of verses. Together, we developed a methodology to turn programming concepts into rhythmic verses that could be memorized, shared, and recreated without written documentation. In the classical age, she explained during the dim hours when guard supervision was lightest, poets encoded forbidden political ideas into seemingly innocent verses. The meter and rhyme weren't just aesthetic, they were functional, making the message memorable despite censorship. We adapted this tradition for code, creating patterns where syntax elements corresponded to specific verbal rhythms. Object-oriented structures became story characters. Functions became actions. Logic flows became plot developments. "They can search your pockets," she said with quiet defiance, "but never your mind. Your program exists as long as you can remember it and teach it to others." Over time, our cell became an invisible laboratory. We tested memory techniques, optimized our code verse structures, and refined the conceptual architecture of what would later become Zanjir. During exercise periods, we would whisper key concepts to other trusted female prisoners, distributing fragments of knowledge that would later be reassembled outside. Paradoxically, the authorities' rehabilitation program provided perfect cover. During sessions on appropriate female vocations, we would appear engaged in learning traditional crafts while actually incorporating their patterns into our encryption systems. When asked to write essays on women's proper role in society, I would compose seemingly compliant text while mentally refining distribution algorithms. The notification of my father's death came 16 months into my sentence. A prison administrator reading from an official form, clinical and detached, Ibrahim Khoury, age 57, cardiac arrest. No additional details provided. No compassionate leave for the funeral. Just an approved 10-minute call to my mother, monitored by prison officials. Her voice, thin with grief, told me more than her careful words. The harassment had been relentless after my conviction. My father demoted at work, our home repeatedly searched, neighbors questioned about the family's activities and loyalties. His heart couldn't bear what they did to his name, to his dignity, my mother whispered, the subtext clear beneath her circumspect phrasing. He had died of a broken heart, compounded by the stress of constant surveillance. That night, alone on my thin mattress, I made a decision that transformed my imprisonment from punishment to preparation. I would honor my father not through grief alone but through completing what he had started, the work of liberation through knowledge. My mental designs took on new urgency and purpose. When I was released at 25, 3 years to the day after my arrest, I emerged into a world both familiar and foreign. The physical landmarks remained, the same mountains in the distance, the same architectural styles, the same call to prayer echoing 5 times daily. But the social landscape had shifted dramatically. Surveillance had intensified in ways visible and invisible. New cameras monitored major intersections and public spaces. Digital billboards with facial recognition tracked pedestrian movements. Smartphone searches had become routine at checkpoints. The state's digital control apparatus had evolved while I was isolated from technology. My personal circumstances had deteriorated exactly as designed. My name was blacklisted from legitimate employment in any field requiring education. The rare interviews I secured ended abruptly when background checks revealed my record. I was explicitly banned from using computers or smartphones under the terms of my release, required to report weekly to a probation officer who monitored my activities with invasive thoroughness. My movements were restricted to approved districts without special permission. Our family home, once a middle-class symbol of my father's professional success, had been sold to cover legal debts and living expenses after his death. My mother had moved to a small apartment in a less desirable district, her social connections frayed by association with my crimes. She had aged visibly, her previously active community life replaced by cautious isolation. They visit sometimes, she told me during my first night home, voice lowered though we were alone. Men from state security. They ask about you, about who contacts me, about what I hear from your former students. She didn't need to explain further. Our apartment, like our lives, was now under unofficial but constant observation. Yet beneath this bleak surface, I discovered unexpected resilience. The seeds planted before my imprisonment had not been fully uprooted. Through careful, coded conversations with my mother's remaining friends, I learned that some of my former students had continued our work in fragmented, adaptive ways. International human rights organizations had documented my case, classifying me as a prisoner of conscience. Digital rights advocacy groups had used my story to highlight the gendered nature of technology access restrictions. Academic papers discussed the Nadia Curry case as an example of how coding education was becoming a new frontier in women's rights struggles globally. Most crucially, the skills I'd taught had multiplied far beyond our original circle. Women teaching women in living rooms, dormitories, and quiet corners, beneath the radar of official monitoring. The authorities had imprisoned me, the visible node, but failed to recognize that the network had already become self-sustaining. My official reintegration followed their script perfectly. I took an approved job at a women's clothing shop, modest in my demeanor and conversation. I attended recommended religious guidance sessions. I submitted to weekly monitoring and random home inspections. On the surface, I was a cautionary tale, the reformed woman who had learned the consequences of transgression. Behind this carefully constructed facade, I was rebuilding our network with greater sophistication. The first challenge was technological access without detection. Direct computer ownership was forbidden to me by court order, smartphone use monitored through registered SIM cards. Every internet cafe required ID registration linked to a national database that flagged my profile. The solution came through community. My mother's apartment building housed an elderly widow whose son worked abroad and had set up a computer for her to video chat with grandchildren. Mrs. Becerra, partially blind and technologically intimidated, was happy to let me help with her weekly calls in exchange for grocery shopping and companionship. Her computer became my first access point, used in careful 30-minute sessions while appearing to assist her. Through this limited window, I made contact with Professor Hassan, my father's former colleague who had emigrated to Sweden years before. Using encrypted channels and carefully coded language, I explained my vision for what we needed to build. He connected me with the Global Digital Commons, an international tech collective specializing in privacy tools for vulnerable populations. The logistics were painstaking. I could never directly contribute code under surveillance, so we developed an unusual workflow. I would memorize segments of design and functionality using the mnemonic techniques Layla had taught me in prison. During Mrs. Becerra's computer sessions, I would rapidly transcribe these concepts into text documents, upload them to secure temporary storage, then permanently delete all local traces. Global Digital Commons programmers would implement these specifications, then send small fragments back for verification, never the complete system that might trigger monitoring algorithms. Over the course of 11 months, using borrowed devices and proxy connections from a rotating network of trusted allies, we gradually built what I had designed in prison, Zanjir, chain in our language, an encrypted education platform specifically designed to operate in low-bandwidth environments with extreme security concerns. The architecture was revolutionary in its adaptation to our constraints. Unlike conventional applications that relied on client-server models requiring constant connectivity, Zanjir operated as a mesh network that could function without central servers. It used peer-to-peer distribution, allowing content to be cached and transferred offline through local connections when internet access was unavailable or monitored. Most innovative was its authentication system. Traditional security relied on personal identifiers that created vulnerability, usernames, emails, phone numbers that could be traced to individuals. Zanjir instead used authentication methods based on shared cultural knowledge, questions about regional folklore, traditional patterns, and historical references that educated local women would know but that wouldn't appear in any government database. The system continuously rotated these knowledge challenges, creating authentication that was simultaneously accessible to intended users yet resistant to algorithmic cracking. The user interface was designed for plausible deniability, at first glance resembling approved applications for women's interests. The home screen displayed traditional recipes, modest fashion guidance, and approved religious content. Only through specific interaction patterns, inspired by the traditional hand movements of our regional embroidery, would the educational platform reveal itself. What made Zanjir truly unique wasn't just its technical sophistication but its cultural grounding. It wasn't designed by Western privacy advocates imagining our needs from afar. It emerged from the lived experience of women who understood the specific surveillance methods they faced, the cultural contexts they navigated, and the technological limitations of their environments. Each feature addressed real barriers we had encountered in our teaching work. The content distribution system mimicked our cultural practice of family visits. Devices in proximity would automatically exchange updated materials when activated with the correct authentication, similar to how news and information traditionally spread through women's social gatherings. The emergency protocols drew from our regional practice of quickly covering windows during sandstorms, a rapid response system that could instantly obscure all sensitive content. As we approached completion, another challenge emerged. How could I distribute software I was legally forbidden to use? Direct involvement would violate my release conditions and send me back to prison. The solution came from 6 of my former students who had never been identified in the investigation, women who had been peripheral to our original group but had continued learning independently. They became our first implementation team, responsible for testing and distributing the platform while I maintained conceptual direction through carefully obfuscated channels. In the rooftop apartment of Dahlia, one of my former students who had escaped identification during the investigation, we launched Zanjir with 50 users, women selected from the fragmented cells that had continued operating during my imprisonment. The launch wasn't marked by champagne or celebration, but by quiet determination and rigorous security protocols.